The iron horse screamed against a sky the color of bleached bone. It was a lonely sound in a lonely land. A mechanical heartbeat pulsing through an endless expanse of ochre dust and cracked alkali flats. Heat shimmered above the rails, making the distant mesas tremble as if they were just a dream of stone and shadow. Inside the passenger car, the world was reduced to the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel, the groan of timbers, and the fine, gritty dust that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the wilderness that pressed in from all sides. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, sweat, and cheap perfume. A family of homesteaders, their faces etched with a weary but stubborn hope, sat clustered together near the front. Their children, grimy and restless, had long ago exhausted the novelty of the journey. Further back, a slick-haired salesman in a dusty bowler hat attempted to engage a stern-faced woman in conversation, his words lost in the locomotive's ceaseless complaint. Sunlight, thick and syrupy, streamed through the dirty windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the stale air. It was a carriage of strangers, each wrapped in their own thoughts, their own destinations, their own quiet desperations. At the very end of the car, in a seat no one else had chosen, sat Silas Boone. He was a man built on the scale of the mountains he likely called home, with shoulders that strained the seams of his worn canvas jacket, and hands that rested on his knees like carved blocks of oak. He did not seem to be a passenger so much as a piece of the landscape that had found its way inside. His face, shadowed by the brim of a stained felt hat, was a map of sun and wind, with lines that spoke of distances measured not in miles, but in seasons. His eyes, when they were visible, were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing, though they engaged with no one. He sat with a profound stillness, an anchor of silence in the car's restless motion. He had not spoken a word since boarding at a forgotten depot 3 states back. He simply existed, a self-contained world of leather, dust, and quiet resolve. His presence was so complete, so self-sufficient, that the other passengers instinctively gave him a wide berth, their chatter and fidgeting seeming frivolous in the face of his granite composure. The train gave a jarring lurch, its whistle shrieking as it slowed for a water stop, a solitary wooden tower, and a rusting tank in the middle of nowhere. The sudden change in rhythm broke the car's hypnotic trance. Passengers stretched. A baby began to cry, and the salesman gave up on his conversational siege. It was in this brief pause, this momentary disruption of the journey's relentless forward push, that she appeared. She came through the rear door of the car as if propelled by a storm. She was not a woman, not yet, but a girl hovering on that fragile cusp, with a face that should have been soft with youth, but was instead sharp and hollowed with a terror so pure it was almost silent. Her dress, a simple calico print, was torn at the hem and smudged with dirt. Her hair, the color of dry straw, had escaped its pins and clung to her sweat-sheen temples in wild strands. But it was her eyes that held the true story wide, dilated pools of blue that darted around the carriage, not seeing the people so much as assessing them as potential threats or impassable obstacles. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps that she seemed to be trying to swallow, as if even the sound of her own fear was a betrayal. She stumbled, catching herself on the back of a seat. The woman sitting there flinched away, pulling her child closer. The girl didn't seem to notice. Her gaze swept over the homesteaders, the salesman, the weary mother, and in each face, she must have seen a reflection of her own helplessness, a wall of polite indifference she could never hope to breach. Her panic was a live thing, a wild bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs, and it was beginning to draw unwelcome stares. A low murmur started near the front of the car. Then, her frantic eyes landed on Silas Boone. She froze. For a long moment, she simply stared at the massive, unmoving figure at the end of the car. He had not turned his head. His posture had not changed. He remained a silhouette against the glaring window, a man of stone. Perhaps it was his sheer size that drew her, the promise of a physical barrier, Or perhaps it was his isolation. He was already apart from this world of families and salesmen. He existed on the fringe, in the same lonely space where she now found herself. He was not a part of the society she was fleeing. He was something else entirely. With a final, desperate resolve, she moved. Her steps were small and unsteady, as if crossing the length of the swaying car was like traversing a high wire. She ignored the curious glances and the whispered comments that followed her like flies. Her entire world had narrowed to the man in the last seat. She stopped beside him, her small frame trembling so violently it seemed a strong gust of wind might shatter her. He still did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. She had to fight to make her voice work, and when it came, it was a reedy whisper, barely audible above the hissing steam from the engine outside. "Mister," she breathed, her hand clutching a small, worn satchel to her chest as if it were a shield. "Please." Silas did not move a muscle. He gave no sign that he had heard. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was just another wall, colder and harder than the rest. Despair, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. She took a half-step back, ready to bolt, though she had nowhere left to run. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. He didn't look at her face. Not at first. His gaze dropped to her hands, white-knuckled around the satchel, and then to the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He saw the tremor that ran through her like a fever. He saw the raw, animal fear that had stripped her of everything but the instinct to survive. His expression remained unreadable, a weathered mask of neutrality. He did not offer comfort. He did not ask for a name or a reason. His eyes, when they finally lifted to meet hers, were not kind, nor were they cruel. They were simply observant. They saw. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. "Please," she whispered again, the word cracking. "They're looking for me. Can I hide?" Her request was madness. To ask a complete stranger, a man of his intimidating size and silence, for such a thing was to invite disaster. But she was beyond reason. She was running on the last dregs of a desperate hope. For another long moment, Silas simply looked at her. The conductor's call echoed from outside. All aboard. The train jolted, preparing to resume its journey. The sound seemed to break the spell. Without a word, Silas shifted his weight. It was a small movement, but it held a sense of finality. He took the edge of his heavy, fleece-lined greatcoat, an absurd garment for the desert heat, but one he never seemed to be without, and lifted it. He created a dark, cavernous space between his body and the wall of the carriage. It was not an invitation, not an offer of help. It was a simple, physical fact. A space had been made. Ellie didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the opening, ducking under the heavy weight of the coat. The world outside vanished. The light, the curious stares, the dusty landscape, all of it was gone, replaced by a close, encompassing darkness. The space was cramped, pressing her against the rough wood of the train car on one side and the solid, unyielding bulk of the man on the other. It smelled of dust, leather, wood smoke, and something else, the clean, faint scent of the dry wind. The coat fell back into place, a heavy curtain sealing her away. She could feel the vibration of the man's body as he breathed, a slow, steady rhythm that was utterly at odds with the frantic hammering of her own heart. Through the thick wool and canvas, she heard the train's whistle blow a long, mournful cry. The wheels began to churn, the rhythmic clatter resuming its beat, pulling them away from the lonely water tower and deeper into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the west. She huddled in the darkness, making herself as small as possible. Every muscle tensed. She was hidden. For now, she was at the complete mercy of a silent stranger who had not offered a single word of promise, not a single gesture of reassurance. He had only, and without question, provided shelter under the cowboy's coat, with the world roaring past outside. Ellie held her breath and prayed it was enough. Time ceased to have meaning in the suffocating darkness. Ellie was suspended in a world defined by the coarse texture of the coat against her cheek, the unyielding wall of the train car at her back, and the solid, living warmth of the man beside her. Each chuff of the locomotive's steam engine, each clatter of the wheels on the track, vibrated through Silas's body and into hers. It was an unnervingly intimate proximity to a complete stranger. Yet the sheer terror that had driven her into this space overrode everything else. She focused on making her breathing as shallow and silent as possible, convinced that a single, audible gasp would betray her. The air was close, thick with the scent of old wool and the faint, dusty aroma of the man himself. A scent not of sweat or grime, but of open air and distance, as if he carried the very essence of the plains within his clothes. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The train's rhythm was a brutal lullaby, and despite her fear, a profound exhaustion began to seep into her bones. She fought against it, her eyelids feeling as heavy as lead weights. She could not afford to sleep. She had to remain vigilant, to listen, to be ready. Ready for what? She didn't know. The only certainty was the danger that stalked her. The jarring slam of the car door at the far end of the carriage jolted her back to full, heart-pounding awareness. It was a sound of purpose, of aggression, entirely different from the casual entry and exit of a passenger. It was the sound of a predator entering a pen. Under the coat, Ellie went rigid. She felt a subtle shift in the man beside her. Not a startle, but a minute tensing of the muscles along his back, like a mountain settling before a rock slide. It was the only sign he gave that he had noticed. Outside her dark sanctuary, the low hum of conversation in the car died abruptly, replaced by a strained, watchful silence. Then came the voices, thick with whiskey and menace, slicing through the quiet. "Evening, folks," one voice drawled, the false congeniality doing nothing to mask its underlying threat. "Just looking for something that belongs to my associate here, a piece of property that's gone missing." There was a lower, guttural grumble from a second man. The third voice was sharper, colder. "She's a young thing, fair-haired, wearing a calico dress. Might look a little spooked. Any of you fine people seen her?" Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Property. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. That was all she was to them. Not a person, but a thing to be owned, to be reclaimed. She pressed herself harder against the vibrating wall of the train, trying to will herself into non-existence. Heavy, booted footsteps began to move down the aisle. Each step was a hammer blow against her nerves. She could hear the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of clothing as other passengers shrank away from the intruders. She heard the men's low, predatory questions and the faint, frightened murmurs of the passengers' replies. "No, sir. Haven't seen anyone like that. We've been keeping to ourselves." The footsteps drew closer. They were halfway down the car now. Ellie could feel the slow, steady rhythm of Silas's breathing beside her. It hadn't changed. It was as deep and regular as the turning of the earth. How could he be so calm? Did he not understand the danger, or did he simply not care? "Checking every car on this damn train," the first voice grumbled. Much nearer now. "Can't have gone far." The footsteps stopped. They were only a few seats away. Ellie held her breath until her lungs burned. She could smell them now, a foul miasma of cheap liquor, stale sweat, and unwashed bodies that seeped through the thick fabric of the coat. "Well now, what have we got here?" the sharp voice said. It was right next to them. "A man who likes his own company." Ellie felt the man beside her shift again. An infinitesimal movement. His arm, which had been resting loosely at his side, moved with deliberate slowness until his hand came to rest on the iron armrest of the seat. It wasn't a threatening gesture, but it was a definitive one. It was the placement of a boundary. "I'm talking to you, Friend, the voice snapped, impatience fraying its edges. We're looking for a girl. You seen one? Silence. The air in the car grew so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. Ellie imagined the scene playing out just inches from her face, the three menacing figures looming over the solitary, silent man in the corner. She waited for Silas to speak, to deny, to say anything, but he offered nothing. His silence was a void, and it was unnerving. "Cat got your tongue," another of the men sneered. "Or are you just simple?" There was a scraping sound, as if one of the men was leaning over the seat. "Big coat you got there, mister. Mighty warm for this time of year. What you got under there, a little lamb you're keeping all to yourself?" This was it. Ellie's blood ran cold. He would lift the coat. They would find her. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her, so powerful it almost made her retch. But the coat did not move. Instead, she felt a powerful, deliberate shift in the body beside her. Silas leaned forward slightly, a movement that brought his massive shoulders into prominence and subtly, but unmistakably, blocked any attempt to reach for the coat's hem. He still had not uttered a sound. He had not looked at them. He simply became an immovable obstacle, a wall of flesh and bone. "I'd advise you to move along," Silas said. His voice, when it finally came, was a revelation. It was not loud, but it filled the small space with an absolute authority. It was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together deep underground. It was a voice that held no fear, no anger, and no room for negotiation. It was the voice of a man who had stated a fact and expected it to be honored. For a long, charged moment, nothing happened. Ellie could almost hear the thoughts turning in the heads of the men outside. They were weighing the situation, sizing up the man who had spoken. They saw his size, his stillness, the quiet, unshakable confidence that radiated from him like heat from a forge. They were bullies and predators, used to preying on the weak and the frightened. Silas Boone was neither. With a muttered curse, one of the men stepped back. "Ain't worth the trouble," he growled. "She's probably in the baggage car. Come on." The sharp-voiced man spat on the floor. "You're a lucky man, friend, a real lucky man." The heavy footsteps retreated, moving toward the front of the car. The door slammed shut, leaving behind a ringing silence and the lingering stink of their presence. The passengers began to murmur again, a nervous, relieved buzz. Ellie remained frozen, her body locked in a rictus of fear. They were gone from the car, but they were still on the train. The danger was not over. It had only recessed for a moment. She felt Silas's hand leave the armrest. The tension in his body eased, but only slightly. He remained a statue of watchful waiting. A minute passed. 2. The train rattled on, plunging deeper into the hostile landscape. The sun was beginning to dip lower, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. Then, without any warning, Silas stood up. The movement was so sudden and fluid for a man his size that it caught her completely by surprise. The coat rose with him, a dark tent that lifted her from her hiding place. She stumbled to her feet, still half-shrouded, blinking in the sudden, dim light that filtered through the fabric. He didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the landscape flashing past the window. His eyes narrowed against the glare, scanned the terrain with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He was looking for something, an opportunity, an escape route. The train was moving fast now, crossing a wide, flat plain dotted with sagebrush and jagged rock formations. It began to slow slightly as it approached a long, curving bend in the tracks that ran alongside a deep, sandy arroyo. Silas moved, pulling her along with him. He was a force of nature, his grip on the collar of the coat firm and inescapable. He moved to the small, rattling platform between their car and the next. He kicked the door open with his boot, and the world exploded in a deafening roar of wind and steel. The wind tore at them, whipping Ellie's hair across her face and trying to rip the coat from Silas's grasp. The noise was overwhelming, a physical assault of grinding wheels and screeching metal. Below them, the gravel of the railway bed was a speeding, indistinct blur. Ellie's heart leaped into her throat. What was he doing? She looked up at his face, silhouetted against the blood-red sky. His expression was grim, his jaw set. His gaze was fixed on the embankment of the arroyo, now only 100 yards ahead. He leaned down, his mouth close to her ear, so she could hear him over the roar. His voice was a low rumble, a command that vibrated through her entire body. Hold tight. It was not a promise of safety. It was not a word of comfort. It was a simple, stark instruction for survival. She didn't have time to think, to question, to be afraid. She wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face against the rough canvas of his jacket, her fingers digging into the fabric. She held on as if her life depended on it, because she knew, with a sudden and chilling certainty, that it did. He didn't hesitate. As the train hit the apex of the curve, its speed at its slowest, he stepped off the platform and into the void. For a terrifying, weightless second, they were airborne. Then they hit the ground. The impact was a brutal, jarring shock that drove the air from her lungs. They tumbled down the steep, gravelly embankment, a chaotic mess of flailing limbs and flying dust. The world was a spinning, painful blur of grit and sky. The heavy coat, which had been her shelter, was now a smothering, disorienting weight. They came to a stop at the bottom of the arroyo, tangled together in a cloud of red dust. For a moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged, desperate gasps for air. Then, she heard the fading roar of the train as it continued on its way, oblivious, a disappearing speck of civilization in the vast, silent wilderness. They were alone. The sun was a fiery ball on the horizon, and the long, cold shadows of the desert were reaching for them. The escape had begun. The landing was a brutal collision of bone and earth. For a moment, the world was a silent, spinning chaos of red dust and searing pain. Ellie lay tangled in the heavy folds of the greatcoat, the air driven from her lungs in a single, ragged gasp. Every part of her body screamed in protest. The sharp sting of 100 tiny cuts from the graveled slope was a fiery web across her skin. Before she could even process the fall, Silas was untangling himself from her in the coat. He moved with a startling economy of motion, not a single wasted gesture. There was no pause to take stock of his own injuries, no groan of pain. He rose to one knee in a fluid movement, his body a tense silhouette against the dying sun, and his gaze was already fixed back on the tracks, a thin iron scar running across the vast landscape. The train was a distant, dark shape, still shrinking, its fading rumble a ghost on the wind. Ellie pushed herself up, her arms trembling. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she coughed, the dust in her throat feeling like ground glass. She started, her voice a raw croak. Get up, Silas said. The words were not unkind, but they were as hard and unyielding as the rock around them. He did not look at her. His entire being was focused on the problem of their survival. She staggered to her feet, pulling the torn edges of her dress together. Her satchel was still clutched in one hand, a small, pathetic anchor to the life she had just fled. The silence of the desert descended upon them, vast and profound. It was a silence that buzzed with its own life, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush, the distant cry of a hawk, the frantic beat of her own heart. The sun bled across the horizon, casting impossibly long, skeletal shadows from the red rock formations that loomed over the arroyo. It was a beautiful and terrifying sight, a land that promised nothing but hardship. Silas pointed, not at her, but down the wide, sandy wash of the arroyo. They'll stop the train. When they don't find you, they'll come back, on foot, maybe on horseback if they can get him from the baggage car. They'll follow the tracks. His logic was cold, simple, and utterly terrifying. She had imagined their jump as an end, But he saw it for what it was, the beginning of a hunt. "What do we do?" she whispered, the question swallowed by the immense emptiness. He didn't answer immediately. He crouched, scooping up a handful of the fine red sand and letting it run through his fingers, as if testing the wind. He was reading the land, listening to its secrets. He was a part of this place, while she was an intruder, as fragile and out of place as a porcelain doll dropped in a rock quarry. Then he moved. He strode over to a dense clump of sagebrush, its silvery green leaves brittle with dryness. With his bare hands, he began to break off the woody branches, piling them up with a swift, practiced efficiency. He worked without speaking, his movements precise and powerful. Ellie could only stand and watch, a useless, trembling spectator to her own fate. She didn't understand. A fire would be a beacon, a signal that would lead their pursuers directly to them. Panic began to bubble in her chest again, hot and acidic. "No," she said, taking a step toward him. "A fire. They'll see the smoke." Silas paused, a bundle of sage in his hand. He looked at her then, and for the first time, his eyes held something other than detached observation. It wasn't pity. It was a flicker of something harder, a glint of steel that told her he was a man who did not suffer fools. And in that moment, she was very close to being one. "That's the point," he said, his voice flat. He turned back to his work, the brief conversation apparently over. He gathered a larger pile, then moved 50 yards further down the arroyo, in the direction the train had been going. He built a second, smaller pile there. He returned to the first, pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket, and took out a piece of flint and a steel striker. He knelt, shielding his work from the wind with his body. The sharp, metallic scrape of steel on flint echoed in the quiet. A spark, another, nothing. The wind was picking up as the sun set, a cool breath that hinted at the coming night's chill. Ellie shivered, though not from the cold. She watched his hands, large and calloused, work with an incredible delicacy. He was patient, methodical. Finally, a spark caught in the tinder. He'd prepared a small, dry nest of shredded bark. He blew on it gently, coaxing the tiny ember into a fragile flame. He fed the flame with the smallest, driest twigs, then the larger branches of sage. The fire caught quickly, and a thick, pungent smoke began to billow upwards, white and gray against the deepening purple of the sky. The acrid smell filled the air, sharp and clean. He stood back, watching the column of smoke rise, studying how the wind caught it and pulled it eastward, down the arroyo. Satisfied, he turned and strode back toward her, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering firelight. "They'll see that," he said, gesturing with his chin. "They'll think we're down there. Hold up for the night. Gives us time." He grabbed his greatcoat from the sand, shook the dust from it with a single, violent snap, and slung it over his shoulder. He then took her by the arm. His grip was not gentle. It was firm, impersonal, the grip of a man moving livestock. It bruised, but it was also undeniably steady. "We go the other way, now." He pulled her away from the fire, away from the false trail of smoke, and headed toward the sheer rock face of the mesa that formed the northern wall of the arroyo. To Ellie, it looked like an impassable cliff, a solid wall of stone, but Silas seemed to see something else. He moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as if the desert itself bent to his will. He led her to a place where a cascade of fallen boulders and scree formed a treacherous slope against the cliff face. It looked like a dead end, but tucked behind a massive, precariously balanced slab of red rock was a dark, narrow opening, a fissure in the stone, barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. "In here," he commanded, pushing her toward the gap. Fear, primal and claustrophobic, seized her. The opening was a black maw, a wound in the earth that promised nothing but darkness and tight, crushing spaces. "I can't," she breathed, pulling back. His hand tightened on her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. He leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You can, or you can stay out here and wait for them. Your choice, make it fast." There was no choice. With a sob she couldn't suppress, she turned and squeezed into the crevice. The rock was cold and rough against her skin, scraping her arms and shoulders. The darkness was absolute. She could hear Silas right behind her, his large body scraping against the narrow passage. His presence was both a comfort and a terror. The only way was forward, into the suffocating blackness. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening up slightly, other times forcing her to her knees to crawl over sharp, unseen rocks. Her hands were raw, her knees bleeding, but the firm pressure of Silas's hand on her back, guiding and pushing, never let her stop. He didn't speak. There were no words of encouragement, no whispers of "you're doing well" or "it's not much further." There was only the scrape of their boots, the harsh sound of their breathing in the confined space, and his relentless, silent urging. He was not her savior. He was her engine, a force that propelled her forward when her own strength and courage had failed. Slowly, she began to notice things other than her own fear. She noticed the way he tested each footstep before putting his weight down. She noticed how he would place a hand on a particular rock to steady himself, a rock she would have ignored. He was reading the unseen path with his hands and feet, navigating the darkness as if he had daylight vision. Amidst the terror, a new feeling began to take root in the barren soil of her soul, a grudging, bewildered awe. This man was not like anyone she had ever known. The men she knew were loud, or cruel, or weak, their emotions always on the surface. Silas was a creature of stone and silence, his competence so complete, so absolute, that it was a force in itself. He had not promised her safety. He had not offered her kindness. He had simply taken control of her survival, and he was executing it with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. She was afraid, more afraid than she'd ever been in her life. But for the first time since she'd climbed onto that train, she felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. It was a tiny, fragile thing, but it was there. After what felt like hours, she saw a faint gray light ahead. The passage was opening up. They emerged, blinking, onto a wide, wind-swept ledge halfway up the side of the mesa. The full moon had risen, a silver coin in an ink-black sky, bathing the desert in a pale, ghostly light. The air was cold and clean. They were high above the arroyo now. From their vantage point, they could see for miles, and down below, tiny pinpricks of light lanterns were bobbing along the sandy wash. They were clustered around the smoldering remains of the sagebrush fire. 3 figures, small as insects from this height, were circling the false campsite, their movements agitated and angry. Silas stood beside her, a motionless sentinel. He watched the men below, his expression unreadable. His plan had worked perfectly. They had been drawn to the smoke, and now they were wasting precious time on a cold trail. "They'll circle, then spread out come morning," he said, his voice a low murmur that was almost part of the wind. "But we'll have a head start." Ellie stared at the distant lights, at the men who thought of her as property. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran through her. They were safe, for now, thanks to the silent, formidable man beside her. He had promised nothing. He had offered no comfort. He had simply acted. He turned from the view and looked down at her, in the stark moonlight. His face was all sharp angles and deep shadows. He saw her bleeding hands, her torn dress, the exhaustion and fear that clung to her like a second skin. He showed no reaction. "We walk," he said, and started along the narrow ledge, heading deeper into the labyrinth of rock and shadow. The night was a long, cold purgatory. They walked for hours, following the spine of the mesa along treacherous, moon-slicked ledges. The wind was a living thing, a restless predator that clawed at their clothes and whispered chilling threats in their ears. Ellie's body, already pushed past its limits, became an automaton of misery. Each step was a fresh agony. Her feet were a collection of raw blisters. Her muscles screamed with a fire that never dimmed, and her mind retreated into a numb, gray fog where there was only the next footstep, and the next, and the next. Silas was a machine. He moved with a steady, ground-eating stride that never faltered. He was tireless, a part of the rock and the wind, seemingly immune to the exhaustion that was consuming her. He did not offer his hand, nor did he speak words of comfort. But when her foot slipped on a patch of loose scree and she cried out, his arm shot out like a striking snake, his hand clamping around her bicep, holding her fast before she could tumble into the blackness below. He hauled her back onto the ledge without a word, his grip like iron, and then released her, continuing on as if nothing had happened. He was not her protector in any gentle sense. He was her warden, and her prison was survival itself. He would not let her fall. He would not let her stop. He would not let her die. Just before the false dawn, when the sky was a bruised, starless gray, he finally led them down from the high ground. They descended through a series of steep, winding switchbacks, a path that was invisible until they were upon it. By the time they reached the desert floor again, Ellie was stumbling, her vision blurring at the edges. The world was a featureless expanse of sand and shadow. She was certain she could not take another step. "This way," Silas said, his voice a low rasp in the pre-dawn stillness. He led her toward a towering wall of red rock, a sheer cliff that seemed to mark the end of the world. But as they drew closer, she saw that it was not a solid wall. A narrow, almost hidden opening appeared, a deep cleft in the stone, just wide enough for them to pass through. They stepped inside, and the wind died. The air grew still. They were in a box canyon, a secret place walled off from the vast, open hostility of the desert. They walked on, the sand underfoot soft and deep. The towering red walls on either side seemed to absorb the silence, creating a sense of profound and ancient peace. And then, as the first tentative fingers of dawn light touched the tops of the canyon walls, she saw it, a thin, impossibly welcoming curl of wood smoke rising into the still air. It came from a low-slung cabin, built of dark, weathered logs and chinked with mud. It wasn't built on the land so much as it seemed to have grown out of it, nestled against the base of the canyon wall as if seeking its shelter. Beside it stood a small, sturdy corral made of juniper posts, and a chicken coop that was little more than a lean-to. A stone-lined well with a simple wooden crank stood a few yards from the cabin's single door. It was the humblest of dwellings, a tiny outpost of human tenacity in an ocean of wilderness. To Ellie, it looked like a palace. The sight of it broke something inside her. The iron bands of fear and adrenaline that had held her together for a day and a night finally snapped. Her legs gave way, and she sank to her knees in the soft sand, the worn satchel falling from her nerveless fingers. She didn't have the strength to cry. She could only stare at the curl of smoke, proof that this place was real, that this long, impossible journey was finally over. Silas stopped and looked back at her. For a moment, she thought he might leave her there, but he walked back, bent down, and effortlessly scooped her up into his arms. He carried her as if she weighed nothing. Her head fell against his chest, and she was vaguely aware of the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear before the world dissolved into a black, dreamless void. She awoke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and the gentle warmth of sunlight on her face. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn pine logs, dark with age and smoke. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered by a thick, surprisingly soft wool blanket. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and dust, but it was a clean, settled dust, the dust of a home, not the agitated grit of the open desert. She sat up slowly. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled merrily. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A few shelves on the wall held tin plates, a handful of books, and other simple necessities. Silas's greatcoat was hanging from a peg by the door. Everything was worn, but immaculately clean and orderly. It was a space of profound and quiet purpose. Silas was at the fireplace, his back to her, tending to a black iron skillet. He moved with the same quiet efficiency she'd seen in the desert, his large frame completely at ease in the small space. He seemed to sense her stirring, because without turning, he spoke. "There's water in the bucket." His voice, so harsh and commanding in the wild, was softer in here, a low rumble that was absorbed by the wooden walls. She looked and saw a wooden bucket with a dipper resting on a small stand near her cot. Her throat was a raw, aching desert. She drank, the water so cold and clean it felt like a blessing. The cabin door opened, and a boy came in. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair and a face smudged with dirt. He wore patched denim trousers and no shoes. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes wide and serious, a startlingly clear shade of gray widening further in surprise. He was holding a small wooden pail. He looked from Ellie to Silas, a silent question in his gaze. Silas turned from the fire. He looked at the boy, and his face, that weathered, unreadable mask of stone, softened almost imperceptibly at the edges. He nodded once, a small, simple gesture. It was all the explanation the boy seemed to need. The boy's gaze returned to Ellie. The surprise was still there, but it was now tempered with a quiet curiosity. There was no fear in him, no suspicion. He walked over to the table and set his pail down with a soft clink. "Those are for the chickens," he said, his voice clear and a little shy. "They like the scraps." He looked at her torn dress, her scratched hands, her tangled hair. "You look all tuckered out, ma'am." "Tom," Silas said, his voice holding a gentle note of warning. "It's all right," Ellie said, her own voice still hoarse. "He's right. I am." She tried to smile, but her face felt stiff. "My name is Ellie." "I'm Tom," the boy said, a small, hesitant smile touching his lips. "Silas found me." He said it simply, a statement of fact, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, like saying the sun rose in the east. Silas slid a tin plate of bacon and what looked like cornbread onto the table. "Eat," he said to Ellie. It was another command, but this time it felt different. It was the command of a caregiver, not a captor. The food was simple, but it tasted like the finest meal she had ever had. The salt of the bacon, the rough, satisfying texture of the cornbread, it was all real, all solid. It was the taste of safety. While she ate, Tom chattered quietly, telling Silas about a coyote he'd seen near the North Ridge and how the black and white hen was sitting on a new clutch of eggs. Silas listened, occasionally grunting or nodding, his attention fully on the boy, watching them. Ellie felt a strange ache in her chest. Their bond was in the spaces between the words, in the shared silence. A deep and unshakable understanding that needed no explanation. After she had eaten, Tom took her by the hand. His own was small and calloused. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you." He led her outside into the brilliant, clean light of the canyon. The sun was higher now, and the air was warm. He led her to the chicken coop, a cheerful, noisy place. He showed her how to reach gently under a clucking hen to retrieve a warm, smooth egg. He placed one in her palm. The warmth of it, so full of life and promise, seemed to seep directly into her skin. It was a simple, perfect thing. "You have to be gentle," he instructed, his small face serious, "or you'll scare 'em, and they won't lay." Later, she helped him pump water from the well. The handle was heavy and squeaked in protest, but the rhythm of it was steady and satisfying. Water, clear and impossibly cold, gushed into the bucket. Some of it splashed onto her dress, leaving a dark, muddy stain on the hem. She looked at it, and instead of the shame and fear that any sign of disarray had once brought her, she felt nothing but a quiet sense of peace. It was honest dirt, the mud of a place where people lived and worked. It was not the grime of flight. She spent the day in a dreamlike state, moving through the simple rhythms of the homestead. She helped Tom feed the 2 horses in the corral. She sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunlight move across the canyon walls, turning the red rock from fiery orange to deep purple. The world had shrunk to this small, protected pocket of peace. The train, the men, the terror, it all felt like a fever dream from another lifetime. Here, there was only the sun, the smell of old wood and baking dust, the clucking of hens, the patient strength of the rock walls. These ordinary things, things she had never had the time or the peace of mind to notice before, now felt like miracles. The warmth of a freshly laid egg, the splash of cold water, a smear of mud on a worn-out dress. They were the liturgy of a life she had never dared to imagine, a life where one could simply breathe. As evening fell, Silas returned from mending a fence at the far end of the corral. He moved without a sound, and for a moment, he just stood and watched her and Tom sitting on the porch steps. His face was in shadow, unreadable as always, but Ellie felt his gaze not as a threat, but as something else, something watchful, steady. He had brought her to this place. He had saved her, not with promises or gentle words, but with hard, decisive action. And now he had given her this, a day of peace, a chance to simply be. It was more than anyone had ever given her before. She looked from the silent, formidable man to the small, trusting boy beside her, and felt the first, fragile tendrils of a new and unfamiliar feeling begin to unfurl within her battered heart. It was a feeling that felt terrifyingly like trust. Days bled into one another in the peaceful, sun-drenched canyon. The brutal rhythm of flight was replaced by the gentle cadence of life. Ellie learned the language of the homestead, a dialect spoken in the creak of the well pump, the soft clucking of hens, and the low nicker of horses at dusk. The raw terror that had been her constant companion began to recede, its sharp edges smoothed by the steady, quiet routine. She mended Tom's shirts with clumsy stitches, her hands slowly remembering the simple domestic arts she thought she had forgotten. She learned to tell the time by the shifting angle of the shadows on the canyon walls. In this newfound quiet, the memories began to surface, not in a terrifying flood, but in small, poignant waves. During the day, she could keep them at bay, focusing on the solid reality of her chores. But in the evenings, after Tom had gone to his small bunk in the corner and the world shrank to the flickering circle of firelight in the cabin, the silence would grow heavy with the things she had never said. She would watch Silas as he sat by the fire, his large hands methodically working on some small task, mending a piece of tack, sharpening a knife, or carving a small wooden bird for Tom. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a solid, grounding thing. He was a man who seemed to have no need for words, content in the silent company of the fire and the night. It was this very quality, his profound and unshakable stillness, that both intimidated her and made her feel safe. He did not pry. He did not ask where she'd come from, or what she was running from. He had accepted her presence as simply as he accepted the rising of the sun. But his unspoken questions hung in the air between them, and she knew, with a growing certainty, that she could not truly inhabit this peace until she had answered them. The moment came on an evening like any other. They had just finished a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Tom, sleepy and content, had bid them good night and was already lost in the deep, untroubled sleep of a child. A soft rain had begun to fall outside, a gentle drumming on the roof that seemed to enclose the small cabin even further, making it the only real place in the world. Ellie stood at the rough wooden counter, a basin of warm, soapy water in front of her, and began to wash the tin plates. The simple, repetitive motion was hypnotic. She stared down at her own hands in the murky water, seeing not the nicks and calluses they had acquired here, but the hands of a younger, more frightened girl. She didn't hear Silas move, but she sensed him beside her. He picked up a clean, dry cloth and, without a word, took the first plate she had washed from the rinsing basin. He began to dry it, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as ever. The only sounds were the soft splash of the water, the gentle rasp of the cloth against the tin, and the rain on the roof. They worked in silence for several minutes, a shared, domestic rhythm. It was the simplicity of the act, the quiet, unassuming partnership of it, that finally broke her. It was so normal, so peaceful. It was everything her life had never been. "My father," she began, and her own voice sounded strange and distant in the quiet room. "He wasn't always a bad man." Silas did not stop drying the plate. He did not turn to look at her. He simply continued his task, his stillness a silent invitation for her to go on. "I remember when I was small," she said, her gaze lost in the past. "He used to laugh, a big, loud laugh that made the windows rattle. He'd swing me up onto his shoulders and tell me I was the queen of the whole wide world. He smelled of sawdust and sunshine then." She paused, scrubbing at a plate with unnecessary force. But a thirst settled in him, a terrible, deep thirst that water couldn't quench, and slowly it drank the man I knew. His laughter rusted. His hands, that had once been so gentle, learned how to shake, and then how to strike. The sunshine smell was replaced by the sour stench of whiskey. She placed another clean plate in the rinse water. Silas took it, his large, scarred hand brushing hers for a fleeting second. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a small, steadying warmth through her. "We lost our farm. Then we lost our home in town. We ended up in a boarding house, in a room that always smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. He took work where he could find it, but most of the coin he earned went to feeding his thirst. I tried. I tried to keep things together. I took in mending. I scrubbed floors for other people, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom." Her voice trembled, and she stopped, fighting for control. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was a listening silence. It held no judgment, no impatience. It simply was. Silas placed a dried plate on the stack with a soft click, and reached for the next one. The simple, continued action was all the encouragement she needed. "There was a man," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He started coming around. He had money. His boots were always polished, and he smelled of bay rum and cigars. He would talk to my father for hours, in low voices. He bought him bottles of the expensive stuff. My father would laugh again when he was there. But it was a hollow sound, a ghost of his old laugh. This man, he owned a lot of land, a big spread a few counties over. He was older. His eyes were like little chips of ice. When he looked at me, I felt like a horse he was thinking of buying. He never spoke to me. He just looked." She scrubbed at the basin, her knuckles white. "One night, my father was happier than I'd seen him in years. He told me our troubles were over. He said the man had made him an offer, that all his debts would be cleared. He said I was to be the man's wife. He didn't ask me. He told me a deal had been struck, a bargain had been made, and I was the price." The word wife felt like a lie in her mouth. It was too clean, too respectable a word for what had been intended. I tried to refuse. I begged him, but he wouldn't listen. It was like the whiskey had finally eaten all the way through him, leaving nothing of the father who had called me his queen. He just kept saying it was for the best. Silas had stopped moving now. He stood beside her, the cloth still in his hand, a plate half dried. He was a statue of perfect stillness. She could feel his attention on her, a palpable weight. "I ran," she whispered, "the night before I was supposed to be sent to him. I took the few coins I had saved from my mending work, and I just ran. I ran until my lungs burned, and I bought a ticket for a train, any train, that was heading west. I thought if I could just put enough distance behind me, but his men were at the station. They were looking for me. They got on the train, and that's when I saw you." Her story was finished. The words hung in the air, fragile and ugly. She let out a long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Tears she hadn't known were coming began to slip down her cheeks, hot and silent. She kept her head bowed, ashamed for him to see her weakness, ashamed of the sordid, pathetic tale she had just told. She waited for his reaction, for pity, for disgust, for questions, for the cold distance of a man who did not want to be burdened by such a damaged thing. Silas did none of those things. After a long moment, he resumed his work. He picked up the plate and began to dry it again, his movements as calm and steady as before. He took the last skillet from the rinse water, drying it with methodical care. He didn't speak a single word. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer a single empty platitude. He simply stood beside her in the quiet cabin, sharing the small, domestic task, the rain drumming a soft rhythm on the roof. He listened not with his ears, but with his presence. His silent, steady, and unwavering action was his reply. It said more than words ever could. "I have heard you. You are not alone in this room. The work still needs to be done. We will do it together." When the last dish was dried and stacked, he took the damp rag from her trembling hands and hung it neatly on a peg to dry. He then picked up the basin of dirty water, walked to the door, and threw it out into the rainy darkness. He came back inside, bolted the door, and went to the fire, adding a fresh log to the embers. He had heard the worst of her, and he had not turned away. He had not flinched. He had simply dried the dishes, and in that simple, profound act, Ellie felt a deeper sense of being heard, of being seen, than anyone's words of pity could ever have offered. The story was told. The burden was shared, and in the quiet that followed, something new and strong began to take root in the shelter of the Red Rock Canyon. The telling of her story did not bring a deluge of questions or a cloud of pity. Instead, it brought a quiet clearing, like the calm that follows a desert thunderstorm. The air in the small cabin, once thick with unspoken history, felt lighter. The silence that fell between her and Silas was no longer a void of uncertainty, but a shared space of quiet understanding. He knew the worst of her past, and he was still there, a steady, unmovable presence in the center of her new life. A subtle shift occurred in the days that followed, a change in the very quality of their shared existence. It was nothing that could be named or pointed to, but Ellie felt it in the marrow of her bones. The routines remained the same: the morning chores, the shared, nearly wordless meals, the long, quiet evenings by the fire, but the tension that had hummed beneath the surface was gone. In its place, a fragile, tentative domesticity began to bloom, as unexpected and as beautiful as a cactus flower after a rare rain. She found herself seeking out ways to contribute, to weave her own threads into the fabric of this quiet life. It was a deep, instinctual need to give something back, to show a gratitude that she had no words for. She started a small herb garden in a protected patch of soil near the cabin wall, coaxing life from the unforgiving red dirt. She took over the mending entirely, her stitches growing neater and more confident with each patched shirt and darned sock. These small acts were her new language, a way of saying thank you without having to speak the clumsy, inadequate words. One afternoon, while searching for wild onions near the mouth of the canyon, she strayed further than usual. She followed a dry wash, her eyes scanning the ground, and found herself in a small, hidden alcove she hadn't seen before. There, sheltered from the harshest of the sun and wind, grew a single, defiant cluster of wildflowers. They were a startling, vibrant blue, each delicate petal a tiny piece of fallen sky against the rust-colored rock. In this land of stone and thorns, their fragile beauty was a miracle. She stood there for a long time, just looking at them. They reminded her of herself, or at least of the person she hoped she could become, something soft and alive, finding a way to grow in a hard, unforgiving place. Carefully, so as not to disturb the roots, she picked a single, perfect blossom. She held it in her palm all the way back to the cabin, its stem a thin, cool line against her skin. Silas was by the corral, re-shoeing one of the horses. He was a study in controlled power, the massive muscles of his back and arms moving with a practiced, fluid grace. The air was filled with the rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil and the sharp, clean smell of hot iron. Tom sat on the fence, watching with the rapt attention of a dedicated apprentice. Ellie hesitated at the edge of the corral, the small, bright flower feeling impossibly foolish and frivolous in her hand. What was she thinking? What would a man like Silas, a man of iron and rock, do with a thing as delicate as a flower? He would likely see it as a useless weed. She felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, and she almost threw it away. But the memory of his quiet presence as he dried the dishes, his silent acceptance of her broken past, gave her a small surge of courage. She walked over to him, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. He paused in his work, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm, and looked at her. His eyes, in the bright sunlight, were clear and direct. She held out the flower. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "By the North Wash. I thought it was pretty." He looked from her face to the small offering in her hand. His expression was, as always, unreadable. He did not smile. His gaze was intense, and for a long moment, he just looked at the impossible blue of the petals. He reached out, his hand grimy with soot and dust, and took it from her. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as they closed around the slender stem. He held it for a moment, turning it over, studying it as if it were a strange and complex mechanism. Then he simply nodded. One single, small nod. He turned, walked to the water trough, and placed the wildflower in a tin cup of water he set carefully on a flat fence post, out of the way of his work. Then he went back to the anvil and the waiting horse, and the rhythmic clang of the hammer resumed. That was all. No words of thanks, no comment on its beauty, just a nod, and the simple, practical act of giving it water. Ellie's heart sank a little with disappointment, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. She turned and went back to the cabin, feeling foolish. The next morning, she rose early, as she always did, to start the fire. The cabin was still wrapped in the cool, gray light of dawn. Silas was already gone, likely checking his trap lines. Tom was a still lump under his blanket. As she moved past the small, sturdy table where Silas sometimes worked in the evenings, she noticed he had left something behind. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, worn and scuffed from years of use. It was open to a fresh page. Her first instinct was to look away, to respect his privacy, but something made her glance down, and there, lying carefully in the center of the page, was the wildflower. He had placed it between the leaves of the book to press it, its vibrant blue a startling splash of color against the pale, yellowed paper. Around it, in a neat, surprisingly elegant script, were a few penciled words. Not a sentence, but labels, as if he were a botanist studying a new specimen. Bluebell, Cleft Rock, North Wash, found by Ellie. She stared at the page, her breath catching in her throat. He hadn't seen it as a useless weed. He had seen it, truly seen it. He had noted its name, its location, and, most importantly, its origin. Found by Ellie. He had preserved not just the flower, but the moment, the simple, tentative gesture she had made. It was a secret act of remembrance, a quiet validation that struck her with more force than the most eloquent poem. In that moment, she understood. His silence was not an absence of feeling. It was a different kind of language, one she was only just beginning to learn. After that, she started to see it everywhere. The days grew hotter, and laundry day became a grueling ordeal. She would haul the heavy buckets of water from the well, her back and arms aching, and scrubbed the clothes on a washboard under the relentless sun. Her only resting place was a hard, unforgiving wooden crate. One afternoon, after finishing a particularly large load, she went to sit down and found the crate gone. In its place was a proper chair, one of the simple ones from the cabin. But Silas had done something to it. He had taken a piece of soft, scrap leather and tacked it neatly across the seat in the back, creating a padded, comfortable surface. It was not a new chair, but he had transformed it, thought of her comfort, and made it better. He never mentioned it. The chair was just there, waiting for her, a silent testament to his observation. Another time, after a long afternoon spent weeding her small, struggling garden, she came back to the cabin, her throat parched, her face flushed with heat. As she reached the porch, she saw a tin cup sitting on the railing, in a patch of shade cast by the roof. It was filled with water from the well, so cold that condensation beaded on its metal sides. He had seen her working, anticipated her thirst, and brought her a drink. He was nowhere to be seen, but the simple, thoughtful gesture was a physical presence. It was a cup of water, but it felt like a love letter. These were the small, unnamed gestures that began to define her days. A loose heel on her only pair of shoes, quietly mended and left by her cot while she slept. A particularly heavy log for the fireplace, split into smaller, more manageable pieces and stacked neatly where she could reach them. The sharpest knife, always left on the counter for her after he had honed it. He never spoke of these things. He never sought thanks or acknowledgement. They were simply done, seamlessly integrated into the rhythm of their lives. They were his words, his promises. Each small act was a brick, and with them, he was quietly, methodically, building a wall of safety and care around her. She, in turn, answered in his language. She made sure his coffee was always hot when he came in from the cold. She took extra care with his meals, learning the simple dishes he seemed to favor. She found a patch of wild mint and would sometimes leave a sprig of it by his plate, a small splash of green that spoke of freshness and care. They were two solitary people, speaking a silent language of deed and observation. It was a romance written not in ink, but in the grain of wood, the coolness of water, the unexpected comfort of a padded chair. There were no breathless promises, no whispered endearments. There was only the solid, irrefutable proof of action. And for Ellie, who had known a lifetime of empty words and broken promises, this silent, steady language was the most beautiful she had ever known. It promised nothing, and in doing so, it promised everything. The fragile peace of the canyon was shattered by a sound that did not belong. It came on the lazy, sun-baked canvas of a late afternoon. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that muted the world. Ellie sat on the cabin's porch, a bowl of freshly picked beans in her lap, her fingers moving in the steady, rhythmic work of shelling them. The soft thump of the beans dropping into a tin pail was the only sound, save for the drowsy hum of insects and the quiet scratching of charcoal on wood, where Tom sat a few feet away, completely absorbed in drawing a picture of a horse. The world was safe. The world was small. The world was theirs. Then came the sound. It was a low, percussive beat, a distant thudding that was not the familiar gait of Silas's two horses. This was different, heavier, more urgent. Ellie's hand stilled over the bowl. She lifted her head, her body going rigid, a wild animal sensing a change in the wind. Tom looked up, his wide gray eyes questioning. The sound grew louder, resolving itself into the unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses, moving fast. They were in the canyon. They were coming this way. The blood drained from Ellie's face, a cold, familiar dread. An enemy she thought she had outrun, coiled in the pit of her stomach. There was only one reason men on horseback would be in this hidden place. They hadn't given up. They had found her. The cabin door opened. Silas stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been cleaning his rifle. a task he performed with the quiet reverence of a priest tending an altar. He had heard it too. He didn't look at Ellie. His gaze was fixed on the mouth of the canyon, his body perfectly still. But every line of him was suddenly as taut as a drawn bowstring. The easy domesticity of the homesteader had vanished, stripped away to reveal the hard, dangerous man beneath. "Ellie," he said, and his voice was the low, flat crack of stone breaking. "Get the boy inside, now!" She didn't question. She scrambled to her feet, spilling beans across the porch, and grabbed Tom's small hand. "Come on, sweetie, inside." Tom, his face pale with a fear he didn't understand but recognized in her, allowed himself to be pulled into the cabin's dim interior. Silas stepped back, letting them pass, then moved to block the doorway, his body a formidable wall of muscle and resolve. He did not pick up the rifle. He simply stood there, waiting. 3 riders emerged from the screen of junipers at the canyon's entrance, their horses kicking up plumes of red dust. Even from a distance, their posture was one of predatory arrogance. They slowed as they saw the cabin, fanning out, their movements practiced and menacing. As they drew closer, Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized them from the train, the sharp-faced, sneering man in the lead, the hulking brute beside him, and a third, wiry man with shifty eyes. They reined in their horses 20 yards from the cabin, the animals stomping and blowing in the sudden quiet. "Well, now," the sharp-faced man drawled, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He pushed his hat back, revealing a pale, sweaty brow, his eyes, small and hard as pebbles, fixed on Silas. "Look what we have here, a squatter. We've been tracking our property for a long time. Friend, seems it ran to ground in your little hole here." Silas said nothing. His hands were loose at his sides, his face an unreadable mask. "We know she's in there," the man continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "The girl, Ellie. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No trouble for you." "She's not here," Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard with absolute finality. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't play dumb with me, Cowboy. We found her tracks, found where you jumped the train, found where you set that clever little fire. You've been a real thorn in my side, but the trail ends here. Now, for the last time, send out the girl. Turn around and ride out," Silas said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of what was going to happen. The sharp-faced man's smile vanished. His face hardened into an ugly knot of impatience. "Boys," he said, his voice dropping, "it seems the man wants to do this the hard way." It happened in a blur of violent motion. The 3 men swung down from their saddles simultaneously. The brute and the wiry man charged forward, while the leader stayed back, pulling a long-barreled pistol from his belt. Silas met them not with hesitation, but with an explosive forward surge. He was not a man fighting. He was a force of nature unleashed. He sidestepped the wiry man's clumsy rush and drove the heel of his hand into the man's throat. The man went down with a sickening, gurgling cry, clutching at his neck. The brute, a man nearly Silas's size but slower, swung a fist the size of a ham. Silas ducked under it, the wind of the blow ruffling his hair, and drove his shoulder hard into the man's midsection. The air left the big man in a great whoosh, and he staggered back, his face a mask of pained surprise. From inside, Ellie watched through a crack in the door, her hand clamped over Tom's mouth to stifle his cries. Her world had devolved into a nightmare of grunts, the thud of fists on flesh, and the panicked stamping of horses. Then another figure appeared, seemingly from the rocks themselves, an old man, wiry and tough as sun-cured leather, carrying a pitchfork. It was Raoul, a prospector who lived in a small dugout a mile down the canyon and sometimes traded with Silas. He must have heard the riders. He let out a reedy, defiant yell and charged toward the leader, holding the pitchfork like a lance. The sharp-faced man, startled by this new arrival, turned and fired his pistol. The shot was a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Raoul cried out and stumbled, the pitchfork clattering to the ground as he clutched a bloody shoulder. The distraction was all the brute needed. While Silas was momentarily turned toward the sound of the shot, the big man recovered and charged, tackling him around the waist. The two men went down in a cloud of dust, a chaotic tangle of limbs, rolling and grappling, their grunts of effort raw and animalistic. Ellie's blood ran cold. The cabin door, which Silas had been blocking, was now open, and the wiry man, recovered and enraged, saw his chance. He ignored the struggling giants on the ground and scrambled to his feet, his eyes locking on the open doorway. On her, on Tom. "Get back!" Ellie screamed, pulling Tom behind her. But the man was too fast. He lunged into the cabin, a hunting knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He grabbed for Ellie, but she shoved Tom behind her, putting herself in the way. The man snarled and shoved her aside. She fell hard, her head cracking against the leg of the table. The room spun, spots dancing in front of her eyes. Through the dizzying haze, she saw the man grab Tom. He clamped a filthy hand over the boy's mouth and dragged him back toward the doorway, holding the knife to his small, pale throat. "Silas!" Tom's muffled scream was a sound of pure terror. Outside, the fight stopped. Silas had gained the upper hand. He was on top of the brute, his fist drawn back, but at the sound of Tom's cry, he froze. He looked up and saw the wiry man in the doorway, the firelight glinting on the blade held to Tom's neck. A terrible, profound stillness fell over the yard. The only sound was the wiry man's ragged breathing and Tom's terrified whimpers. "That's enough," the sharp-faced leader said, getting to his feet and leveling his pistol at Silas's head. "Get off him, now!" Slowly, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Silas rose. His face was a thundercloud of helpless fury. He was trapped. The one thing in the world he could not defend against was a threat to the boy. The brute lumbered to his feet, breathing heavily. He saw his opening. With Silas standing, vulnerable and focused on Tom, the big man swung a club-like fist. It caught Silas square on the side of the head with a sickening crunch. Silas's eyes glazed over. He staggered, a great oak struck by lightning. He took one step, then another, before his legs gave out and he crashed to the ground, face down in the red dust. He did not move. "No!" The scream was ripped from Ellie's throat. The world seemed to slow down. The sneering faces of the men, the glint of the knife, the small, terrified form of the boy he had sworn to protect. The sight of Silas, her rock, her rescuer. Lying still and broken in the dirt, it all converged into a single, unbearable point of agony and rage. The fear was still there, a cold, shaking sickness inside her. But something else rose up to meet it, a fierce, primal fire she never knew she possessed. It was the memory of a warm egg in her palm, of a padded chair, of a flower pressed in a book. It was the love for the small, crying boy, and the deep, unspoken debt she owed the man lying unconscious in the yard. They had taken her peace. They had hurt her boy. They had struck down her protector. They would not win. Silas's rifle was still propped against the wall, just inside the door. She moved. Her limbs felt heavy, disconnected, but she forced them to obey. She scrambled on her hands and knees, ignoring the throbbing pain in her head. She reached the rifle. It was heavy, heavier than she could have imagined, and it smelled of oil and power. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold it. She pushed herself to her feet, using the door frame for support, and lifted the long, wooden stock to her shoulder. It felt alien, a terrible and foreign weight. She looked down the long barrel. The wiry man holding Tom was a blurry, wavering shape. "Look at this," the leader sneered, his attention still on Silas. "The little mouse has found a gun." He started to turn his pistol toward her, but he was too slow. Ellie did not aim. She did not think. She closed her eyes, pointed the barrel in the direction of the man holding Tom, and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with the force of a mule kick, slamming her back against the wall. The sound was a deafening explosion, a roar that filled the canyon and seemed to split the world in two. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled her nostrils. A scream of pain answered the shot. Not Tom, the wiry man. He shrieked and staggered back, dropping the knife, his hand flying to his leg where a dark stain was already blossoming on his trousers. He had let go of Tom. The boy, free, scrambled away from him, running toward the still form of Silas. The sudden, violent turn of events threw the other two men into confusion. They had come for an easy prize, not a desperate gunfight. The leader looked from his wounded man to the unconscious giant on the ground, to the wild-eyed girl in the doorway. Still holding the smoking rifle, he saw the calculation of risk and reward shift dangerously against him. "To hell with this," he snarled. "Let's go." He grabbed his wounded comrade, hauling him toward his horse. The brute, needing no further encouragement, was already scrambling into his own saddle. In a flurry of panicked motion, they mounted up, turned their horses, and galloped away, disappearing back into the shadows from which they had come, leaving behind a ringing silence, a wounded old man, and the wreckage of a peaceful afternoon. The rifle slipped from Ellie's nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The strength that had surged through her vanished, leaving her weak and shaking. The canyon was quiet again, but the peace was gone, replaced by the acrid smell of gunpowder and the terrifying, motionless silence of the man lying face down in the red dust. The echoes of the gunshots and the thundering retreat of the horses faded, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more terrible than before. For a long, stunned moment, Ellie could only stand in the doorway, the world a blurry, tilting mess. Then the ringing in her ears subsided, and the scene snapped into sharp, horrific focus. Raoul, the old prospector, groaning as he tried to sit up, his shoulder a dark, wet stain. Tom sobbing quietly as he knelt beside the motionless form of Silas. That sight broke the paralysis. A new kind of energy, cold and clear and desperate, surged through her. "Tom," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the boy's grief. "Go to Raoul. See if you can help him." The boy looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt, but he obeyed instantly, scrambling over to the old man's side. Ellie ran into the yard, her feet sinking into the dust beside Silas. She dropped to her knees. "Silas," she whispered, her hand hovering over his back, afraid to touch him. He was so terribly still. For a man who was the very definition of life and power, this utter lack of motion was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. "Silas, can you hear me?" There was no response, only the shallow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his back. He was breathing. The knowledge was a small, desperate spark in a vast darkness. She gently touched his shoulder. "We have to get you inside." It was a monumental task. He was an anchor of dead weight, a mountain of a man. With Raoul injured and Tom too small, the burden fell to her. She hooked her hands under his arms and pulled. He didn't budge. Dust puffed up around them. Panic began to claw at her throat. She could not leave him here. "Raoul," she called out, her voice cracking with strain. "Can you help?" The old man, with Tom's assistance, had managed to get to his feet. He was pale, leaning heavily on the boy, his left arm held stiffly against his body. "Just a flesh wound. Girl," he gritted out, his face tight with pain. "Hurts like the devil, is all. The boy and I, we can push." Together, in a grim, desperate choreography, they moved him. Ellie pulled, her muscles screaming, her feet scrabbling for purchase in the dirt. Raoul and Tom pushed from behind, their combined strength barely enough to make a difference. They dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, across the yard and over the threshold, leaving a long, dark trail in the dust. They got him onto his own cot, which groaned in protest under his weight. In the dim light of the cabin, he looked even worse. A dark, ugly bruise was already purpling along his temple, and a thin trickle of blood matted his hair. Raoul, breathing heavily, sank into a chair. "Need to look at that head wound. Girl, get some clean water and rags." He looked at his own shoulder. "And if you've got any of that cheap whiskey he keeps for snakebite, I could surely use a drop. For medicinal purposes. You understand." The next hour was a blur of grim, focused activity. Ellie moved with a purpose she didn't know she possessed. She found the whiskey for Raoul, who, after cleaning his own wound with a wince, showed her how to gently clean the gash on Silas's head. The task was intimate and terrifying. Her hands, which had trembled so violently while holding the rifle, were now surprisingly steady as she dabbed away the blood, revealing the ugly swelling beneath. Her fear had not vanished, but it had been transformed into a cold, fierce resolve. Raoul, his strength failing, finally allowed Tom to help him back to his own small dugout, promising to return in the morning. The cabin door closed, and Ellie and Tom were alone with the unconscious man. The silence that descended was absolute. The long, terrifying night began. Thus started the vigil. The world outside the cabin walls ceased to exist. There was no sun, no moon, no past, no future. There was only the cot, the flickering lamplight, and the sound of a man's ragged breathing. Ellie did not sleep. She sat in a wooden chair beside him, her entire being focused on the small, essential signs of his life. She became a student of his stillness. She learned the subtle rhythm of his breath, and her own heart would seize with terror at every slight hesitation, every shallow intake of air. She bathed his face with a cloth dipped in cool water, her touch infinitely gentle on his rough, sun-weathered skin. She saw the lines of exhaustion and pain etched around his eyes and mouth, and a fierce, protective ache bloomed in her chest. Tom was her silent, solemn partner. The boy did not cry again. He seemed to understand that his tears had no place here. This was a time for quiet strength. He sat on the floor by the cot, a piece of charcoal and a plank of wood in his hands, and he drew Silas on horseback, tall and strong, the hero of the canyon. He drew the cabin with thick, protective walls. He drew pictures of the sun, big and bright and yellow. He did not speak, but his drawings were a fierce, silent prayer, a child's desperate attempt to redraw reality, to make the world right again through sheer force of will. When Ellie's shoulders began to slump with exhaustion, Tom would quietly get up, fetch a fresh dipper of water, and hold it out to her. He was a small, steady presence in the overwhelming silence, his loyalty a quiet echo of the man they both watched over. On the second day, a fever took hold. Silas's skin, which had been cool and clammy, grew hot to the touch. He began to murmur, his head tossing back and forth on the pillow. The sounds were guttural, nonsensical fragments of words that spoke of some dark, inner struggle. It was worse than his silence. His stillness had been terrifying, but this restless delirium was a sign that he was being pulled further away from them, into a place they could not follow. Ellie's resolve wavered. The cold competence that had sustained her began to crumble, replaced by a raw, gnawing fear. What if he died? What if this man, who had become the entire foundation of her world, simply slipped away? The thought was a physical blow, leaving her breathless. She was not a healer. She knew nothing of medicine. She was just a girl who had been running her whole life. She looked at Tom, his small face illuminated by the lamp, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own. She looked at the strong, kind boy who had accepted her without question. She looked at the man on the cot, the man who had sheltered her, protected her, and asked for nothing in return. And in that moment, the last vestiges of the terrified girl she had been were burned away. She was not helpless. She would not be helpless. She was all they had. She remembered seeing Silas hang bunches of herbs to dry from the rafters. She didn't know their names or properties, but she trusted his wisdom. She pulled some down bitter-smelling leaves and the dry, purple heads of some kind of flower and boiled them in a pot, filling the cabin with a pungent, earthy steam. She soaked a rag in the hot infusion and laid it gently on his forehead. She didn't know if it would help, but it was an action. It was a fight. She spent the entire night replacing the cloths, bathing his hot skin, whispering to him. She didn't know if he could hear her. "You have to stay, Silas," she murmured, her voice a low, desperate prayer. "Tom needs you. You have to stay." Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, the fever broke. His thrashing subsided. His breathing, which had been harsh and labored, deepened into a slow, steady rhythm. The heat receded from his skin. Ellie laid her head down on the edge of the cot, her body trembling with a relief so profound it was painful, and for the first time in 3 days, she slept. She awoke with a start, the morning light streaming through the cabin's single window. The fire was out. Tom was asleep on his blanket on the floor, his charcoal clutched in his hand. For a panicked second, she thought she had failed, that she had slept while She looked at the cot. He was awake. His eyes were open. They were clear, the color of a pale winter sky. They were not looking at the ceiling or the wall. They were looking at her. The world stopped. The cabin, the morning light, the sleeping boy, it all faded away, leaving only the charged, silent space between them. His gaze was not clouded by pain or confusion. It was direct and deep, and in it, she saw a universe of things she had no words for. She saw the knowledge of what had happened. She saw the raw, aching vulnerability of a strong man laid low, and she saw a gratitude so profound it was humbling. She looked back at him, and her own eyes told their own story. They told of her fear, of her vigil, of the fierce, protective fire he had ignited in her. They told him that she had not run, that she had stood her ground, that she had fought for him, for them. It was a conversation held in perfect silence, a meeting of 2 solitary souls in the quiet morning light. He had been her rescuer, and now she was his. The roles had reversed, and in that reversal, an unbreakable bond had been forged. He had taken her in, a creature of pure fear. He now looked at a woman of quiet, unshakable strength. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. It was the first she had ever seen. Ellie felt the last, cold knot of fear inside her finally, completely, dissolve. It was not just the fear of the men who had pursued her. It was the deeper, colder fear of being worthless, of being helpless, of being alone. That fear was gone. She had faced the darkest parts of her past and had not been broken. She had faced down armed men. She had held life and death in her trembling hands and had not faltered. She was no longer the girl who had hidden under a cowboy's coat. She was the woman who had saved his life, and in the clear, steady gaze of the man who had promised her nothing, she finally found everything she had ever been searching for. She was home, and she was not afraid. Recovery was a slow, quiet tide. It did not rush in, but seeped back into Silas, day by painstaking day. The silent, profound understanding that had passed between them when he first awoke became the new foundation of their world. The roles, once so clearly defined, had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer just the rescuer, and she was no longer just the rescued. They were something else entirely. In the first days, he was a giant trapped in a cage of his own weakness. He could do little more than lie on the cot, his frustration a silent, simmering thing in his eyes. The blow to his head had left him dizzy, and his body felt like a stranger's, heavy and uncooperative. For Ellie, these days were a continuation of her vigil, but imbued with a new, tender purpose. The fear was gone. replaced by an unwavering, gentle authority. She fed him broth, spoon by patient spoon, holding the bowl steady as he struggled to sit up. She did not fuss or coo over him as another woman might have. Her care was practical, direct, and deeply respectful of the powerful man he was. When he would clench his jaw in frustration at his own helplessness, she would simply meet his gaze, her own calm and steady, and continue her work. Her silence said, "It is all right. I am here. Let me be your strength for now." And he, a man who had never accepted help from anyone, learned to yield. He learned to accept the cool cloth on his forehead, the steadying hand on his shoulder, the quiet presence that never left his side. Tom was a small, orbiting son of quiet devotion. He would bring Silas his treasures, a smooth, gray stone from the wash, a hawk's feather, one of his better charcoal drawings. He would sit on the floor by the cot and tell Silas about the day's small events in a low, serious voice, as if delivering a vital report, and Silas would listen, a flicker of a smile sometimes touching his lips, his eyes following the boy with a fierce, protective love that was now tinged with a new, profound gratitude. He knew, without having to be told, what these two had done for him. He knew they had stood between him and the darkness. After a week, he was strong enough to move from the cot to the chair by the fire. It was a journey of a few feet, but it was a monumental victory. Ellie stood by, her arms outstretched, ready to catch him, but he made it on his own. His jaw set with determination. He sank into the chair, his body trembling with the effort, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him. Ellie simply brought him a cup of coffee and placed it in his hands, her fingers briefly brushing his. The touch was light, but it was a current of shared understanding. With his slow return to strength, the rhythm of the homestead began to reassert itself. But it was a new rhythm, a harmony for three instead of a melody for two. Their lives, which had run in parallel tracks, now began to weave together, creating a pattern so intricate and natural it felt as if it had always been this way. The first day he was able to walk outside. He stood on the porch for a long time, leaning against a post, simply breathing in the clean, dry air. The canyon, his sanctuary, was unchanged. The red rocks were just as tall, the sky just as vast and blue, but he was seeing it through new eyes. He saw Ellie in her small garden, her back to him, tending the fragile green shoots. He saw the way the sun caught the gold in her hair, the quiet grace in the line of her neck as she worked. He saw not a frightened refugee, but a woman who had faced down violence and death to protect his home, his boy, his life. A feeling, deep and powerful and unfamiliar, settled in his chest. It was a feeling of profound, unsettling rightness, as if a piece of his own soul that he hadn't known was missing had finally, quietly, clicked into place. Life became a tapestry of small, unspoken affections. It was in the way she began to anticipate his needs before he was aware of them himself, a tool laid out for a job he was about to start, a bucket of fresh water waiting by the corral after he'd been working in the sun. It was in the way he started to adjust his own routines to hers, timing his return to the cabin in the evenings so they could watch the last of the light fade from the canyon walls together. His silent presence on the porch, a comforting bookend to her day. There was no grand declaration. There was no moment of reckoning. Their love story was not written in the dramatic ink of confessions and promises. It was written in the language they had created together, a language of quiet actions and shared spaces. One afternoon, a few weeks after the attack, Silas decided the corral fence needed mending. One of the posts had been splintered by a stray bullet. He was still not at his full strength, and the work was slow and deliberate. The sun was hot, and Ellie watched him from the cabin, her heart aching with a tender protectiveness as she saw him pause, leaning heavily on a post, to wipe the sweat from his brow. She filled a tin dipper with the coldest water from the well and carried it out to him. He was bent over his work, his back a landscape of taut muscle under his worn shirt. "Silas," she said softly. He straightened up slowly and turned to her. He looked at the water she was offering. Then his gaze lifted to her face. The harsh afternoon sun was in her eyes, making her squint slightly, and a smudge of flour from her morning's baking was on her cheek. And in that moment, a real smile. Not the flicker she had seen before, but a genuine, slow-spreading smile, transformed his rugged face. It softened the hard lines, crinkled the corners of his eyes, and reached all the way to their clear, winter sky depths. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She felt her own lips curve in response, a smile that was hesitant and yet full of a joy so pure it felt like a physical warmth spreading through her chest. He took the dipper, his calloused fingers brushing against hers, and this time the touch lingered for a second longer than necessary. He drank deeply, his throat working. He handed it back to her, their eyes still locked. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. They said, "I see you. I know what you are doing. It matters." Her smile said everything back. "I am here. I will always bring you water. This is where I belong." It was a conversation more intimate than any whispered words of love. It was a pledge made in the full, honest light of day, witnessed only by the red rocks and the silent, listening sky. That simple moment became the new cornerstone of their existence. The fear was a ghost, a distant memory of another life. She no longer looked toward the mouth of the canyon with a knot of dread in her stomach. The men would not be back. She knew this with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the quiet, formidable presence of the man working on the fence, this small patch of earth, guarded by his strength and her resolve, was impenetrable. Their evenings changed. They still sat by the fire, but now a comfortable, easy silence replaced the questioning one. He would carve, and she would mend, their hands moving in a shared, quiet industry. Sometimes, Tom would fall asleep with his head in her lap, and she would gently stroke his hair, a wave of fierce, maternal love washing over her. Silas would watch them, his carving forgotten in his hands, his expression soft in the firelight. In those moments, the three of them were not a collection of rescued strays. They were a family. There was no proposal. There was no talk of a preacher or a ring. Such things belonged to another world, a world of contracts and formal promises. Their world was built on a foundation of something far stronger, far more real, a shared past of terror and survival, a shared present of quiet, steady care, a shared future that was as unspoken and as certain as the rising of the sun. His promise had been in the shelter of his coat. Hers had been in the cool cloth on his fevered brow. His vow was in the mended heel of her shoe. Hers was in the hot coffee waiting for him at dawn. They needed no other words. Every action, every shared silence, every quiet look that passed between them was a renewal of a bond that had been forged in violence, tempered in fear, and now, finally, allowed to rest in a deep and abiding peace. They were for each other. No promises were necessary, for every moment of their life together had become a sacred, unspoken oath. The high, relentless heat of summer slowly relented, its fiery grip on the canyon softening into the gentle, golden warmth of autumn. The quality of the light changed, slanting lower in the afternoons, painting the red rock walls in hues of honey and rust. A new crispness rode the morning air, and the nights grew colder, drawing the three of them closer to the crackling heart of the fireplace. The passing of the season was a quiet, unspoken confirmation of their permanence. The violent intrusion of the outside world had been a brutal storm, but it had passed, and in its wake, life in the canyon had not only survived, it had put down deeper, stronger roots. The homestead was no longer just Silas's domain. It was theirs. A silent, intricate partnership governed their days, a dance of shared responsibilities that required no words. Silas would rise before the dawn, his movements a familiar, quiet shuffling in the darkness. By the time Ellie had the fire going and the coffee boiling, He would be returning from the corral, the scent of horse and cold morning air clinging to him. Their hands would brush as she passed him his cup, a simple, everyday contact that was as grounding as the earth beneath their feet. He began to teach Tom the ways of the canyon. They would leave in the mornings, the tall, silent man and the small, eager boy, and return hours later with stories in Tom's eyes and, sometimes, a rabbit for the stew pot. Silas taught him how to read the tracks of a coyote in the dust, how to know which plants were good for eating and which would kill you, how to listen to the language of the wind. Ellie would watch them go, a profound sense of peace settling over her. She was not just a guest here, a refugee hiding from the world. She was the keeper of the hearth, the steady center to which her two boys, one large and one small, would always return. Her own domain expanded. The small garden, under her patient care, yielded a surprising bounty of tough, flavorful vegetables. She learned to cook with what the desert provided, her meals becoming a testament to her own growing resourcefulness. She was no longer afraid of the vast, empty spaces outside the canyon. They were not a threat, but a larder, a place of hidden life and sustenance. The world, which had once seemed so full of menace, was slowly revealing its secrets to her. One afternoon, while sorting through Silas's few belongings, she came across the heavy greatcoat. It was still covered in the fine red dust of their escape, a relic from that other life. She took it outside and beat it until the dust flew in a great cloud, a symbolic cleansing of the past. As she did, her fingers found a long, ragged tear in the shoulder seam, likely from their tumble down the arroyo. That evening, by the firelight, she set about mending it. She used the strongest thread she had, her stitches small and neat and even. It was slow, careful work. She was not just patching a piece of cloth. She was healing a memory. This coat had been her first sanctuary, a dark, smothering shelter born of desperation. Now, her hands, steady and sure, were making it whole again, just as this place and this man had made her whole. Silas sat across from her, carving a new handle for an axe, the wood shavings curling at his feet. He watched her, his hands never pausing in their work, but his attention was fully on her. He watched the lamplight catch the soft curve of her cheek, the intense focus in her eyes, the gentle, rhythmic pull of the needle. He said nothing, but she felt his gaze, and it was as warm and as comforting as the fire itself. When she was finished, she held it up, inspecting her work. The seam was strong, the dark thread barely visible against the dark wool. She folded the coat neatly and placed it back on its peg by the door. A silent guardian once more, its history now a part of their own. Life settled into a deep, comfortable groove. Raoul, the old prospector, became a regular visitor, hobbling over once a week for a hot meal and a game of checkers with Tom. His shoulder had healed into a stiff, angry scar, but his spirit was as tough as jerky. He would bring news from the nearest settlement, a town a hard 2-day ride away. He told them that no one had seen or heard from the 3 men who had attacked them. It was as if they had been swallowed by the desert, the first time he said it. Ellie felt a final, distant tremor of her old fear. But then she looked at Silas, his calm, steady presence filling the small cabin, and the tremor subsided, vanishing for good. The past had no power here. It could not breach these walls. The first frost came, a silver blanket that dusted the canyon floor at dawn and melted by mid-morning. The days grew shorter, the shadows longer. There was a sense of the world settling in, preparing for the coming winter. They had laid in a good supply of firewood. The cabin was secure, and their small larder was full. They were ready. On one of those clear, crisp autumn afternoons, after the day's chores were done, Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. He glanced at Ellie, who was reading to Tom on the porch steps, her voice a low, soothing murmur. He didn't speak. He just gave a slight nod toward the high trail that led out of the canyon toward the west rim. It was an invitation. Ellie's voice trailed off. She looked at him, and a slow, quiet smile spread across her face. "Tom," she said, closing the book, "I want you to finish stacking that kindling for me. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," the boy said, already scrambling to his task. Happy to be given a grown-up responsibility, she stood up, brushing the dust from her dress, and walked to where Silas was waiting. He fell into step beside her, and, together, they began to walk, their shoulders occasionally brushing. They walked in a comfortable silence, a silence that was not empty, but full of everything that had passed between them. It was full of the roar of the train, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the quiet hiss of a fever breaking, the shared smiles over a cup of water. They climbed the familiar trail, their boots scuffing on the loose rock. The air grew thinner and cooler as they ascended. When they reached the rim, the world opened up before them. The sun was beginning its slow descent, a great molten ball of orange that set the western sky on fire. The vast expanse of the prairie stretched out below them, a sea of gold and russet grasses that seemed to go on forever. The light was thick and golden, a honeyed glow that gilded everything it touched, making the ordinary world seem sacred and new. They stopped at the edge of the overlook, the wind gently tugging at Ellie's hair. For a long time, they just stood and watched, side by side, as the day bled into evening. This was the landscape he had come from, the world he had carved a life out of, and it was the world she had run to, seeking an escape, and had found a home instead. She looked at his profile, silhouetted against the glorious, dying light. She saw the stranger from the train, the formidable rescuer, the patient caregiver, the silent partner. She saw all the men he had been to her, all of them now settled into the one man who stood beside her, his quiet strength a shield against the world. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers, a familiar, comforting weight. She leaned her head against his shoulder for just a moment, a gesture of complete and utter trust. Then she straightened up and looked out at the endless horizon. "At first," she said, her voice a soft whisper that was almost carried away by the wind, "I only asked to hide under your coat." She paused, gathering her thoughts, her heart full of a feeling so large and so peaceful it had no name. "Now," she continued, turning to look up at him, her eyes shining in the golden light, "I just want to walk beside you through sunshine and rain." The words hung in the air between them, simple and true, a declaration that was more real than any flowery vow. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. It was the final, quiet unfolding of her heart. Silas did not speak. Words were not his language. He looked down at her, and in his eyes, she saw it all. She saw the echo of her own journey, the reflection of her own hard-won peace. She saw a love as vast and as quiet as the landscape before them. He did not need to speak. He answered her in the only way he knew how. His hand tightened around hers, a firm, warm pressure that was a promise, a vow, and an acceptance all in one. It said everything. "I am here. I will not leave. We will walk together." He turned, still holding her hand, and led her away from the edge of the cliff. He led her toward a wide, open meadow, where the last of the season's wildflowers, small, tough, purple and gold, still bloomed amidst the dry grasses. Together, they stepped off the hard rock of the trail and into the soft, yielding field. They walked into the heart of the sunset, their long shadows stretching out behind them, two solitary figures merging into one, stepping into a future that held no grand promises, but was more certain and more trustworthy than any oath ever sworn. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please share your city or country in the comments below to connect with fellow listeners. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more ears, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.